Welcome to Be Time, everybody. I'm BehaVR, healthcare executive, author, and host of this podcast. Each week on Be Time, I have the privilege of interviewing a seasoned executive, company founder, or other healthcare expert, and we talk about a variety of healthcare topics. So whether you're inside the healthcare industry or out with a large company or small, Be Time has something for you to help you stay on top of your game. So let's get started. Many of us have heard the term digital therapeutics. The Digital Therapeutics Alliance describes digital therapeutics as follows. These are medical interventions delivered directly to patients using evidence-based, clinically evaluated software to treat, manage, and prevent a broad spectrum of diseases and disorders. Digital therapeutics have been increasing in the amount of offerings and coverages under health plans, and also in the number of conditions that they cover. It's just growing really, really rapidly. And today, our guest is Aaron Gani, who is the CEO and founder of BehaVR, which is a company that uses virtual reality to help people manage mental and behavioral health challenges. I was blown away when I started to dive into this area a little bit about how effective digital therapeutics, virtual reality, so on and so forth, can really be in helping people live their best lives. Now, I've known Aaron Gani for about 20 years, and we've collaborated much over that time period. I was not surprised when he decided to venture out of corporate America and start his own company. He has a background in innovation, operations, risk management, and technologies for a number of well-known companies. And I'm really excited to hear what Aaron and his team at BehaVR are really doing to help people manage these mental and behavioral health conditions. Please join me in welcoming Aaron Gani to the Be Time podcast. Aaron, welcome to Be Time.
Thanks, Beth. Great to be with you today.
Well, we are very, very glad to have you. So, Aaron, what I'd really like to do is start with an industry perspective, and then we will narrow our focus from there. I was hoping you could explain to our listeners what is digital therapeutics and why is this category of treatment important?
Sure, happy to. So, think of digital therapeutics as a clinically validated intervention to improve some aspect of health. That's sort of the simplest way to think about it. So most of what can be done effectively with digital interventions relate to mental and behavioral health, but not all. So there are ways to use digital interventions to engage us physically as well. So you'll find across the digital therapeutic spectrum, mostly focus on anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, addiction, et cetera, things that would squarely fit in a mental and behavioral bucket. But now, particularly in certain mediums like virtual reality, you can also engage a patient at a physical level. But here's the key. There's a whole sea of wellness products on the market, many of which are really evidence-based and quite effective, but many of which are not. And a really useful construct in the digital therapeutic space is a sort of federally managed pathway to get an FDA clearance so that whether it's a patient, a practitioner, a payer, or an employer, they can have more confidence about this intervention being evidence-based, validated as clinically effective, and sort of safe to use. And so that's the summary way to think about it, is something that the FDA has looked at to say, you know what, we understand this is evidence-based, it's safe, it's effective, and it's a solid intervention for a particular condition.
So if you're a consumer out there and you're looking at a specific product or service, you'll want to be looking at their website to say, because they'll say if they're FDA cleared, right?
Yes, definitely. And again, I'm not suggesting that everything that is not FDA cleared is necessarily problematic. It can just be a little harder to tell. So I think that if you're looking for something that you can have a greater degree of confidence, has had all of the effort put in to prove, safety and efficacy, you want to look for those FDA cleared, generally prescription digital therapeutics.
That makes sense. Now, you mentioned behavioral health, and we're going to talk about that a little more deeply in a few minutes, and specifically around what your company that you founded, BehaVR, does. Are there other conditions that can be managed or really helped with digital therapeutics outside of the behavioral health arena?
Yeah, so I touched on this briefly. So most of them are in, if you think about our physical health, there are a lot of things that, our body may need that digital is going to be it's going to be a challenge, right? To make it useful as an intervention. So most of what you'll find in digital are things that are sort of in the CNS, central nervous system or psychiatric space, right? So again, anxiety or depression or substance use disorders or ADHD. Some are interventions that are related to or sort of comorbid with chronic conditions. So think about interventions around sleep or pain or other things that might be, the indications for use of the therapeutic may be for certain populations who are struggling with some other, let's say, chronic condition, right? So it tends to be more in that realm. But as I mentioned, with immersive media like virtual reality and augmented reality, now the lines begin to blur a little bit because certainly we can engage with psychoeducation and mindfulness and things that are more traditionally thought of as mental or behavioral interventions, but also get into physical activation with guided and gamified movement and full body engagement. There's some really interesting research in things like the power of alternative embodiment in a virtual reality setting, where, for example, in eating disorders, there will be people who have a problematic sort of mental model, or in the brains, there's a thing that some researchers call the brain body matrix, where you'll have this inappropriate or unhelpful view of your sort of how you perceive your body being embodied in an alternative way inside a simulation can help reset that brain body matrix. So it can get pretty deep as you get into that space and sort of peel that onion. But generally speaking, think about mental and behavioral interventions as most of what's happening in digital therapeutics today.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. Now, again, we will dive into what you're doing, but I just want to set the context, I think, just in sort of one more area. When I think about digital therapeutics, or I think about earlier stage digital therapeutics, or those that have come to market earlier, I think about an app. So is my thinking correct that really early on, most of the introduction of digital therapeutics were tied to an app, and that now we're just becoming more advanced with virtual reality? Or is there a different way to think about that, Aaron?
Yeah, I'd encourage you to think about it maybe slightly differently. You are exactly right that when you look at the medium that most people are engaging with to consume this stuff, it is generally apps and smartphones, because those are so ubiquitous, right? They're just such a big part of our lives. But what's really happening in the app? Like, what is the therapeutic is sort of a more interesting question. Generally, what people are engaging with is a digitized form of some cognitive behavioral therapeutic technique, right? And so CBT is not a monolithic thing. There are many process-based therapies within the CBT umbrella, but generally think what people are consuming when they're on that app, when they're on that smartphone, is maybe it's education about a condition so they understand it differently. Maybe it is aspects like cognitive reframing of unhelpful thoughts, right? Or other engagement techniques that have sort of been proven effective in CBT with contingency management techniques and so forth. So you can think of the 18 or 19 different sort of generally accepted process-based therapies in a CBT construct that had been digitized and put into an app format on a smartphone. That's mostly what's happening. That's why it gets so interesting when you start going beyond that to other media. So another example that is here's an example that's not simply a digitized form of CBT. There's a company called Akili that is pretty well known for having one of the early FDA cleared therapeutics for ADHD, and it is in the form of a video game. That is not cognitive behavioral therapy. That's an intervention to sort of gamify and train the focusing of attention. And that's, I'm sure, Eddie Martucci and his team at Akili would have a much more articulate way to describe what they do. but it's a video game that has therapeutic effect. It's not necessarily just always a digitized form of CBT, although generally speaking, that's what's happening in the digital therapeutic space today.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. So let's get to what BehaVR does. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your organization? You're steeped in virtual reality. What is it? Why does it matter in digital therapeutics?
Sure. Well, the first thing, the reason I founded BehaVR with the focus that it has, at a personal level, I'd been in healthcare since 2006 when I joined Humana, which is where you and I met, had many years that together, which was great. But I had, for most of my life, intended to start my own company and build something from scratch. So I'd spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what problem is worth spending 10 years of my life on, and so many sleepless nights and so on. And what I settled on, because of the great work that we were doing together at Humana, was this. I became more and more aware of this metacomorbidity of mental and behavioral health, and particularly how, when intersected with chronic conditions, boy, life gets bad in a hurry. And people who are often really among the most expensive and burdensome in the healthcare system from a financial perspective, they get 2 to 3 times worse off, right? So it's a huge area of need in terms of pain and suffering, a huge area of opportunity to unlock value. And the incumbent healthcare system is just not up to the task. There are not enough caring trained clinicians to go around, and that problem is getting worse, not better. So it's a space that's just crying out for digital interventions, which can be more cost effective and more scalable. So for me, that was the problem to tackle. Right? Was, okay, this is a big, important, meaningful space. I also had seen firsthand with my immediate family and extended family and friends the dramatic impact that struggling with mental and behavioral health conditions can have. It really doesn't matter how good your physical health is, everything gets bad in a hurry. That was the problem side of the equation. On the solution side, it was 2016 when I founded BehaVR, and I'd been thinking a lot. You'll recall my job in my last few years at Humana was to think about technology advancement, right? Not what we were doing today, but what was coming down the pike. And so I spent a lot of time looking at that and became aware that virtual reality as a medium, which you can think of as just a multisensory simulation. We tend to think of these headsets like an Oculus Quest, but what it's really about is replacing the sensory input primarily through visual, but also auditory, and now increasingly through sort of physical sensation, right, and what we feel. Replacing that sensory input to the brain so that the brain really can't distinguish at a deep level your reality from this new simulated reality. Our brains really aren't evolved to do that. If we change the visual input or the auditory input and it's consistent with how we experience normal life, the brain says, this is my new reality. This is what I'm really doing. So that's very powerful for activating some older parts of our brain, particularly around threat processing, and how we have sort of evolved over millennia to stay alive by being very sort of in tune with our environment and threats in our environment. It's that sort of neurological effect, that power of that multisensory simulation that your brain's threat processing centers really can't differentiate from real. That is part of what makes VR so effective for things like exposure therapy. So digitizing and making very repeatable and controllable at a personalized level exposure to stimuli or situations that are problematic, traumatic, stressful for us. And so for those who have paid at least some attention to VR in healthcare, they're probably aware of really interesting research that's been done over really a couple of decades around things like exposure therapy to address PTSD, for example, or exposure therapy for fear of social situations, or exposure. So those are exposures that are intended and designed to drive arousal, to drive your sort of fear and your arousal response up. So then as you sort of live through that, you become desensitized and you can challenge your own assumptions about that. That's a sort of subset of techniques that's referred to as inhibitory learning. But there are other ways to use that exposure element, that sense of putting your brain in a situation that feels real. And it's as simple as this in some cases. Let's put you in a place that feels really calming and really relaxed and really peaceful. And let's get you out of a mindset maybe where you're very anxious and you're already aroused and you're all fired up. Let's get you calmed down. Let's get you breathing deeply, diaphragmatic breathing, practicing mindfulness, get you in a state where psychoeducation can be more effective, where digitized CBT techniques like cognitive reframing can be more embodied and feel real and more memorable, and so on. So I'll sort of pause there, but what I saw, and then my team and I built out, is the ways to use this neurological power of this medium to create simulated experiences to deliberately either arouse or calm us, and then to use that to drive change.
So if we take the example that you mentioned of social situations, and let's use the exposure example, this would allow me to be exposed to that situation in a safe and effective manner, so that when I am in the real social situation,
Yeah.
my brain says, "This is okay. We know how to deal with this." Am I sort of getting
That's
that?
exactly right. That's exactly right. It's I'll often say to people, think about, why do we train pilots in flight simulators instead of just with books, right? I mean, obviously you got to spend time training in a real airplane, right? But a lot of what even very accomplished, very experienced pilots will do is you put them in a flight simulator. Why? Because it's a full multisensory simulation. So you're not just thinking about it, you're doing it. And so most of what happens in talk therapy is, particularly if it's CBT related, which is generally sort of the most studied and kind of most evidence-based, approaches that are in use today. If you can find a therapist that practices CBT and get in to see them in less than 3 months or 6 months, it's talk therapy. You're thinking about your thoughts, right? So if you're my therapist, we're having a conversation and you're challenging me to think about, well, what about that situation is problematic for you, Aaron? Or how is your reaction helpful to you or useful to you? And why might that be? So we're spending all this time thinking about our thoughts, which is actually pretty effective. The problem is it's very time consuming, it's pretty costly, and there aren't enough clinicians to go around. With a VR simulation, we can go beyond thinking about those thoughts to experiencing those challenging or problematic situations, and then still in very new and innovative ways interact with our own thoughts. So we do things. Let me give you an example. We have a module in some of our newest products that is an embodied experience of cognitive reframing. Cognitive reframing is a CBT technique where you identify a problematic thought. If I present in this group, everybody's going to think I'm stupid. That's the problem. So then I take that, and if you were my therapist, you might walk me through a process of thinking about, well, what evidence is there really, Aaron, that that's true? So let's gather evidence for that. I screwed up that time I presented to the board and somebody laughed at me, or I might have some evidence that that's true. Let's gather evidence against that thought. So, and then let's weigh that, and then let's reframe it. Well, that's all good. That's generally done through a talk therapy or maybe a workbook or something that's just sort of very abstract. In VR, what we do is we have you verbalize the problematic thought. It appears before you. You now have some control over it. You can manipulate it. You go into really a gamified experience where and we do this with the metaphor of apple trees. You grab an apple and you record into the apple your evidence for and against. You put it in a basket, you weigh the evidence for and against, and then you reframe it. All of this is sort of this gamified thing. The technique is the same. This is a translation of evidence-based CBT techniques, but it's this multi-sensory gamified simulation. And our patients have talked about just how memorable it is and how powerful it is to see and manipulate and feel like they have distance from and control over those thoughts. So that's an example of, it doesn't always have to be some sort of like exposure therapy. Just putting you in this fully immersive, embodied experience can be much more emotionally powerful and memorable. So the possibilities just go on. And of course, all of that is digitized. So we're also doing very interesting things like, as you interact with that whole experience, we're capturing all that data, putting it into your patient profile. Your clinician can go back and review what you thought about, the thoughts that you captured and so on. So you can see all the benefits of digitization that go along with that.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. Now, talk to me about virtual reality and its use in care delivery. Has it been around for a long time, or is this relatively new? And what have been some of the obstacles to adoption?
Yeah. So that's one of the really neat things about VR. It is actually not that new. There have been studies, like clinical, randomized control studies in healthcare use cases for 2 decades. 20 years this stuff has been around. The chairman of our scientific advisory board is a guy named Dr. Walter Greenleaf. He's been at Stanford since 1980. He was involved with VR in healthcare before it was called VR. I jokingly call him the godfather of medical VR. And everybody in the space knows Walter. He's a wonderful, sweet guy and so knowledgeable. And he's been there and done that. Like, he's seen everything that's been tried. What has changed in the last 5 years is VR for most of those years was enabled by very expensive, big, bulky technology that was underpowered. The simulations were okay. They weren't that good. They were still very effective, even with like very low res graphics and so on. But the technology just wasn't quite up to the task. What changed in 2016, well, I founded the company in 2016. What changed just prior to that in really 2015 timeframe was there was a Kickstarter company called Oculus. They raised some money on Kickstarter real quick overnight and raised 20 million or something, and then got bought by Facebook. Mark Zuckerberg bought them for a couple of billion. That sort of set off this whole, influx of capital into the space. What the Oculus team and then Mark Zuckerberg saw, and others, there's HTC and Samsung, and there were a few companies there at the time, is that we'd finally gotten to a point with, really enabled by the smartphone era, with these cheap and ubiquitous sensors and gyroscopes and cloud computing and graphics chips finally being up to the task, that we could actually create consumer grade, cost effective, scalable virtual reality equipment, finally. And that's what kicked off right around 2015, 2016. It has every year and a half since, there's a new generation of technology that's that much better still, which is exactly what we were counting on. And so now we and a handful of other companies, and more every day, frankly, are able to treat VR as just the latest layer on a whole stack that enables all this. It's cloud computing, it's interoperability, it's analytics, it's mobility, 5G, and now VR and AR headsets. And so it's really a first in human history that we can create these really incredible simulations and put them to good use in healthcare.
All right. So it usually does start with an invention, if you will, or some inflection point within a particular area, right? And so, kudos to you for tapping into that and seeing that inflection point. So let's talk about your organization, BehaVR, a little bit more. Specifically, what solutions do you offer? Are you exclusively in the behavioral health space? Who are your customers? Are they health plans? Are they provider organizations? Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So what we are focused on, our purpose is to create a more resilient world, liberated from fear and pain. That's our objective. And we define fear as really a set of related conditions around anxiety and depression and the things that are sort of these mental health challenges that get in the way of our best life. Pain, particularly chronic pain, is not the same thing, but it's very adjacent to those conditions, right? So for many, many people who are struggling with mental challenges, anxiety, depression, substance use disorders, et cetera, there's a heavy overlap with the population of people dealing with chronic pain. Not everybody. Some people only deal with pain and they don't have other mental challenges, but there's a lot of overlap. So that's the area we're focused in. What we do to sort of bring all that to life is we're looking for the most interesting IP from prior research and all of what's been learned over those prior 20 years to either sort of distill that and embed that in our own protocols, or in some cases to in-license from leading researchers proven techniques and protocols that we think map really well to the unique mechanisms of action in VR that I sort of touched on, right? The calming influences and exposure therapy and gamified movement and so on. So we're looking to translate that proven science into these immersive and engaging XR experiences, VR and AR, for mental and behavioral health. We have had over the last few years a handful of relatively narrow wellness programs to sort of learn in areas around stress resilience, pain neuroscience education, maternal mental health, not super ambitious products in terms of like how long they took to build or how much resource went into them, but they were really learning exercises. In the digital realm, you need to iterate, you need to get real patients, real clinicians, real data so that your next generation can be better, particularly when the when the platforms, the technology capabilities are moving so fast as well. What we're doing now, having built sort of that knowledge base and built a data set that enables us to learn from all those tens of thousands of interactions, is we are going really next level with our programs around anxiety and depression. We announced in October a collaboration with Sumitomo Dynapon Pharma from Japan to develop, clinically validate, seek FDA clearance for, and then globally commercialize therapeutics for anxiety and depression, specifically social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and major depression. We have a pipeline product around chronic pain that takes pain neuroscience education, mindfulness, pain relief and distraction, and then gamified mindful movement. And we have a great partner in Confluent Health from Louisville, Kentucky, Larry Benz and his team. Long story short, they're really the number one footprint in the physical therapy and occupational medicine space, with thousands of clinicians, thousands of sites of care and worksite clinics and PT clinics. And so we have a development and commercialization relationship with them as well. So that's the idea. So around chronic pain, around anxiety and depression, developing clinically validated, ultimately FDA cleared therapeutics that we will be commercializing in the US and globally.
So then are you offered through a provider, or do you go to the health plan directly from a coverage and a reimbursement perspective?
Yeah, so these things, a digital therapeutic is intended to be prescribed by some qualified healthcare practitioner, not necessarily an MD, but somebody who's qualified depending on the intervention. And so it really starts there, right? Designing something that is a force multiplier for the clinician, because as we said, there aren't enough of them to reach everybody, right, to scale up. So if you're my doctor, you need to be able to order it for me or prescribe it, oversee it, but not have to be there with me all the time when I'm using it, right? I may use it at home on my own time, but connected to you via the cloud. So it really begins with the clinicians. And then as we build evidence around not just the efficacy, the FDA cares about, is it safe and effective? As you all know, payers care about something else. Does it improve overall healthcare utilization, and can it save us money? Because that's critical in the system, right? So as we get those health economics outcomes research studies done, and we can go to a Humana or an Anthem or an Aetna and say, not only is this safe and effective, it does improve health, and it will reduce overall utilization, that's when the payers will really get behind this and be more enthusiastic about digital therapeutics broadly.
Well, to your point, there are a lot of people that don't have access to the types of providers that they need, number one. But number two, I would just think, as a consumer, thinking about, I don't want to say convenience, but thinking about being able to have more consistency, because I have a tool like this available to me that, I may get anxious, and I definitely will get anxious outside my therapy visits, right? So to be able to have that tool on hand for reinforcement, I think is just really, really critical.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned that the whole idea was in 15, the technology now became more ubiquitous, available. Now it's scalable. So what's the ballpark cost of this? Is this something that the consumer can afford, or that the health plans are willing to pay for because it is, will save money?
So the general state of virtual reality hardware is such, like really the leading device right now in the consumer space is the Meta Quest 2, right? Formerly known as the Oculus Quest 2. It's a $299 headset that is completely self-contained, no wires connected to any external PCs or anything, incredibly high resolution. If we get a little bit wonky for a second, there's a concept in VR called 6 degrees of freedom versus 3 degrees of freedom. In the last few years, VR headsets were mostly of a sort where it would track your, if you move your head around and you look around, your view would change in there, which is sort of what fills your brain. But if you moved around in space, it didn't track you. That was called a 3 degree of freedom headset. 6 degree of freedom, which is like what the Oculus Quest has, you are being tracked in space. So you can, the number one most retentive application in, or type of application in the Quest is actually fitness related. What Meta is finding, and even to their surprise, is how much fitness is really exploding in VR, because you're in this completely immersive, fully embodied, gamified experience and doing cool stuff like, batting balloons around or boxing or whatever. And there's some real benefits around how immersive and engaging that feels. There's also clinical studies that show really interesting effects, like time to exhaustion is longer in VR. Negative sensations of sort of physical discomfort are lower in VR. So there's some things that are really, really powerful and effective. Anyway, so that's VR, this fully embodied, gamified sort of experience. $299 headset that just 18 months ago didn't exist. And there's next generations coming, and it's like a lot of sort of technology S curves. We're still very much on that steep part of the curve. So we're going to see, very strong rumors, as you know, they never verify, but, rampant rumors that Apple will be announcing a mixed reality headset sometime in 2022. So VR and AR. So that's very likely to come. And so it's a really interesting time. It's pretty affordable for consumers. Most people still don't have them. A lot of people still have never heard of VR, although that's changing fast. To the question of will payers pay, you know this better than I do. Payers are interested in things that work, that make their members healthier and save money, right? If you get all of those things, payers will be interested. That's a lot of data. You got to get out there and treat a lot of people and do a lot of studies. It takes a lot of time and money, but we're going to get there. Not just behavior, but a lot of our kind of peers in the digital therapeutic space. The ones that understand that formula and are very laser focused on that are going to meet with success.
Well, and I also think, Aaron, that when I think about what it is you're doing, this really has the opportunity to lower risk for people as well, right? Possibly be able to lower use of pharmacy, right? And just really be able to work with people with a different approach and different technique that'll not only lower cost but lower risk, because as you know, when people are on medications and things like that, just the risk is automatically higher. So it speaks to really improving the quality of that consumer's experience, right?
Yeah, we there's lots of opportunity to avoid inappropriate utilization of the healthcare system, right? So in the chronic pain space, we want to identify people more at risk of interventions that may help some, but are way too risky for many people. Opioids being number one on that list, injections, surgeries, back surgeries and the like. Sure, some people are helped by those things. Many people, it was an inappropriate treatment, right? So they're going to be much better off with a biopsychosocial intervention that is pain education and mindfulness and movement, a lot less risk involved, to your point. And then in other cases, even where some other therapeutic is appropriate, let's say there's a chronic condition where there's a medication that is really helping you and you really ought to stay on it. Well, as you well know, adherence rates, even for medications with chronic conditions, are in many cases abysmally low, right? So pharma, and we do have pharma partners today, a lot of what they're interested in some cases, like Sumitomo Donipon, our partners, they're in on, hey, let's just create what's called a monotherapy. The digital intervention is the therapy. But there are also many use cases where digital can be augmentative to some other, let's say medication for chronic condition, where what we're really trying to do is enhance engagement and adherence, because ultimately adhering to that medication is going to be good for you. So there's a range from making use of the healthcare system more appropriate and avoiding the riskier interventions, all the way to let's keep you engaged in the healthcare system in ways that are cost effective and safe and really help you in the long term.
Oh, that totally makes sense. Now, what is the growth trajectory for digital therapeutics? What is it? It took, 15 years for televisions, I think, to reach 50 million people. And I think it took 30 years for telephones to reach 50 million people, then 15 years for televisions. What's it going to be with virtual reality and digital therapeutics like this?
Yeah, I don't have a great way to describe the curve to you other than to say it is very steep and approaching, vertical. With the smaller group of companies that I've mentioned a few times that are committed to, the highest levels of clinical evidence, FDA scrutiny and clearance, and ultimately HEOR studies around health economics outcomes because, particularly in the US, if payers don't get behind something, it's hard to scale it, right? And so you got to have the evidence of safety, efficacy, and savings. That is a tall hill to climb, but we're climbing it, as are other companies. And there are different opinions about this. I'm out in the investor community a lot, and I certainly meet investors who say, I don't know if I get this whole digital therapeutics thing. I don't know if I buy it. Many do. I happen to think it is absolutely inevitable. I don't think there is no alternative to scaling up interventions in the way that we need. Even pre-COVID, we had a pandemic of mental health challenges in the country, and COVID just made it that much worse. There's no way we're going to scale up the traditional kind of brick and mortar and human clinician infrastructure to solve this problem. Digital must be the answer. And so as long as there are companies and partners and financial backers and investors who are committed to doing the hard work and the heavy lifts to get the level of evidence required, it's going to happen. I mean, what gets paid for today in a fee-for-service system is, does Dr. BehaVR have a license? And she might be fantastic, and she might have just squeaked through. Somebody was last in her class, right?
No.
No, not you though.
She was good.
You, of course. And so there's such an incredible, range of levels of quality, and there can be so much inconsistency in the traditional healthcare system. So another thing digital does is it ups the level of quality and consistency. So I happen to think it's inevitable, and in fairness, I'm biased.
Yeah. Well, no, I know you're a little biased because obviously this is what you do, what you're passionate about. But I just think, me, I always try to put myself in the consumer shoes. And to me, this just seems like this is a better experience, allows for more consistency, allows for more control by the consumer and in empowerment. And then obviously, we don't have enough humans to meet the need for the behavioral health issues that not only this country, but that are being faced around the world, that I think we all know were exacerbated over the last two years. So we all have to really be thinking about what alternatives are there that are available to help people. And, technology is the way to go. Technology is absolutely the way to go to be able to reach as many people as possible.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I don't necessarily think technology, and you're not necessarily arguing this, on its own will always meet the need, but as an adjunct to qualified humans in the right model, right? Maybe it's part of a wraparound care model where, there's a telehealth component with a clinician, but a lot of what you can do on your own time at home in a way that's extremely efficient for the clinician and gathers a ton of data for your doctor, for the payer, et cetera. It just makes too much sense to not happen.
Well, one of your former colleagues educated me, so you notice I didn't use IT, that it's not IT. It's when we think about it, think about business technology. Because that's what it is. It's an integral part of your product, of your service, of your offering. It doesn't sit over here. So to your point, it isn't the technology by itself. It's the co-creation between the business model, right, the services and the technology that really create the win-win. Now, you mentioned, Aaron, you have a partnership with a Japanese pharmaceutical company. Would you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the company is Sumitomo Dainippon Pharma in Tokyo, and we struck a deal in 2020 to jointly develop and then ultimately commercialize a general wellness product. So we started first to set out to build a transdiagnostic wellness product. So no FDA scrutiny or clearance just yet. But that really is intended to become the foundational experience for the multiple FDA cleared therapeutics that we are now pursuing based on our October 2021 deal. The interesting thing about VR is, one of many things, is when you go inside VR, you go somewhere, right? We put you in some simulated environment or situation. So in that transdiagnostic wellness product, you go into what we call your happy place, where you can sort of customize your avatar. You can go over in an education room, sort of feels like a living room, and there's a TV and you can do psychoeducation. There's a lake outside your happy place where you can sit and do mindfulness practice. There's this interactive thing we call the journey map, where you sort of interact and guide yourself through these programs. Well, all of that is the foundational experience for our wellness program. As we bring our 3 digital therapeutics to market over the next several years, those will just become extensions of that experience. So we really will be building out, if I use a little bit of a buzzwordy thing or topical thing right now, it's sort of our corner of the metaverse, if you will, putting you in this place that you will be able to personalize and tailor as your own over time. And the more you engage, the more we can sort of reward you with things to allow you to kind of, feather your nest, as you will, inside that virtual space. Where it'll really start to get interesting and powerful is when we start connecting that to the experience of others. So we add a social component where Beth and Aaron can hang out together in that virtual space because we have been sort of vetted and are qualified by some clinician as having a similar set of challenges or what have you. So Transdiagnostic Wellness Program, we'll be bringing that to market later this year. That was our first collaboration with DSP, Sumitomo Dynapon Pharma. And then the 3 therapeutics was a larger deal we announced in October of 2021. And that's structured very much like a biotech deal, with upfront licensing fees and development milestones and commercialization milestones and so on. And then DSP, because they're a global company, they'll be commercializing that around the globe, both starting in the US through their US subsidiary Synovian, but then also in Japan, EU, possibly China, and other regions.
Oh, that's fantastic. Aaron, we have healthcare leaders that listen to this podcast. They're with health plans, they're with health systems, other areas of the ecosystem. There's startups, big companies, small companies. What would you want them to take away from this podcast as a healthcare leader?
I think right now it's really important that those leaders start to get their heads around this broad space of right where you started, digital therapeutics. It is a big, rapidly growing, sort of emerging subsector, if you will, in healthcare. There are a number of companies here pouring lots of resources into the things we talked about, right? Evidence-based protocols and proven science, digitized in some way, with millions of dollars poured into appropriately designed randomized controlled trials to prove safety and efficacy, and then HEOR studies. It is really a digital form of medicine that we're after. And we see more and more evidence that those leaders, from payers to healthcare organizations to employers, that they're aware and they're starting to wrap their heads around it. But for those who maybe aren't yet paying attention or who still are maybe like skeptical, like, what, can a digital thing really improve health? If you spend some time thinking, I believe you'll reach the conclusion that, well, yeah, absolutely it can, particularly when it's translating proven science and just something more scalable and effective. But if we don't have those leaders sort of leaning in and thinking about what they need to do to enable it, they're going to get behind the curve, right? So it could be somebody in some policy position at a payer of what are we going to cover? And maybe the initial reaction is, well, let me just keep that at bay a little longer. You may be missing out on an opportunity to do something really scalable, really cost effective that's going to improve health and health of your members and save you money. So it's time to lean in and learn more about it and support the sort of evolution of that sector.
That's well said. I would remind leaders that when telehealth really, the uptake was high, obviously, over the last 2 years. And as there have been lots of discussions around, do we make this permanent? How much of it is permanent? I encourage people to stop comparing to how we operate today, right? Because if you were looking at telehealth as an example and say, oh, well, there isn't face-to-face, there isn't physical contact, right? So I can't really go and see. It's kind of like, okay, yes, there are things that it doesn't do relative to what you're used to today. Put that aside for a minute and let's look at all the things it can do that aren't happening today. And that would be the one thing that I would share with leaders that are listening. To your point, lean in, learn what you can about this, and step back. I mean, my mind's going with a number of use cases that you can do well beyond what it is that you're focused on. So it just seems like there's a tremendous amount of opportunity. And again, health plans, providers, you want to engage your patients, you want to engage your members. I mean, this to me is prime opportunity for somebody to say, wow, my health plan really gave me tool, right, to help me be my best self. So all the stuff we say we want to do as a health plan or as a provider system, right? But boy, now they really enabled that by giving me a tool that really enabled me to be my best self. So I would encourage leaders to really kind of think a little bit differently about this. And to your point, lean in, learn more.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing we didn't talk much about, Beth, that I'll mention just very briefly, which is aside from all these benefits of convenience, scalability, more consistent experience for the patient with still connectivity and oversight from clinicians, there's also this huge advantage in terms of the amount of data generated and created, and it is manageable and knowable in these situations. So, payers seek to understand, or employers, or even healthcare utilization. Well, we know if somebody got a prescription, we may know if they filled a prescription. We don't know if they took the pill. Somebody much smarter than me said a few years ago, and I love the quote, imagine if a pill got smarter every time you took it. That's sort of like what digital therapeutics is like, right? Every time somebody engages, we're getting more and more data that is useful for analytics around engagement, around tracking patient health, identifying people who are more at risk or who are getting better, direct their care, et cetera. So there's this incredible closed loop of data, which is it is native in the digital therapeutic space. It's not some sort of an add-on like it is in most of the healthcare system. And then one other thought, there is a great organization called the Digital Therapeutics Alliance that anyone interested in learning more about digital therapeutics should probably start there. The website is dtxalliance.org. It's just what it sounds like. It's a consortium. It's a nonprofit. It's just really there to enhance people's understanding of digital therapeutics across the industry. So it's a great place to sort of start any kind of learning path.
Great. I will put that in the show notes. And how can people get in touch with you, Aaron, if they're interested in learning more?
Well, we are on the web at behavr.com. So BEHAVR.com. And of course, I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter. And for those who are interested in what we're doing and think that we ought to talk, I'd be delighted to meet you.
All right. Well, we will get that in the show notes. Now, Aaron, we'd like to ask our guests what books they're reading or have inspired them, and if there's anything that is a favorite on their podcast playlist.
So, one of the more recent books I read that I found really, really insightful at sort of a strategy level is from Anand, Bharat at Harvard, and it's called The Content Trap. So this is have you read The Content Trap by any chance, Beth?
I've not.
Okay, so I will probably not do this justice, but it's sort of an unpacking of how in an age when so many assets are just digital, right? So whether it's with media properties and whether it's news or music or various forms of information, how do you scale up and make a business sort of extra valuable and protectable in that kind of an environment? And it's really fascinating. The main takeaway I had is it's really not about trying to put up big paywalls around your content. The real sort of more effective strategy is around using the fact that is digital and your ability to measure engagement to identify relevant connections between people or customers and other people, connections between people and other products and products, and talks really interesting about sort of platform companies and how they scale up. And the more people engage in these platforms, the more value you're creating for that end user. And of course, that's good for your business to scale up as well. So that, I thought, it's not really a healthcare focused book necessarily, but really relevant to this age when everything is being digitized and dematerialized, and the pace of change and sort of digital content creation is so fast. I think it's a really interesting strategic read.
Okay, good. Thanks for sharing that. Anything else?
I'll stop there for now.
All right. Aaron, you are really doing wonderful work in a very, very important area. No surprise that you're leading edge, because you always have been. But thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and share what it is that you're doing. I know I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners will feel the same. So again, thanks for being a guest.
Well, you're very welcome, and I appreciate the invitation. It's great to see you, Beth, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a little bit about what we're doing.
And with that, for our listeners, that's a wrap for another episode of Be Time, and we will be back in a week. Thank you.